let me introduce the next panel. You remember that energy was the big thing. That is really the sector that matters. And we have the privilege of having Sahar Shamsi, who's with Oxera. She's a partner with Oxera. And she's a specialist on energy, and there's hardly anybody more knowledgeable about the energy sector than her. And she is going to moderate this panel, and I think she's going to introduce her panelists. And you have until 18:30, until Jennifer Morgan arrives on her bicycle. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Marco and to Patrick for the invitation to chair this panel. We have about 45 minutes together on the topic of transition pathways. As Marco mentioned, I'm a partner at Oxera Consulting. I lead our energy and climate economics practices, and this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I will spend a couple of minutes to introduce the topic. I will introduce our excellent speakers, and then we will open it up to a panel discussion. And I'm hoping also that we will have your questions and answers as part of that. So a couple of minutes to introduce the topic, and obviously coming at the end of such an exciting and rich set of discussions, we have a tough act to follow. But what I would like to do is to use this time as a means of coalescing a lot of the themes that we've heard. Because I think if there's anything that I'm sort of feeling at this point in the day, it's that this topic is too big to think about it in a monolithic kind of way. It is a convergence of forces. It's a convergence of the force of capital markets and the power of prudent capital allocation, as we've just heard on the previous panel. It's about legal frameworks and some pragmatism around that, and hope and optimism, as President Fabius was saying. It is also about the role of regulation. I think we've heard that loud and clear through lots of the panels through the day. So let's take this opportunity to put a corporate-centric industry perspective on it. And that is the challenge and the opportunity for us as this panel, that we're going to build the building blocks of the transition pathways from a multinational's perspective. So the technologies and the regulation and the policies and the capital and the stakeholder acceptance, how they all come together. And to do that, we're going to have two excellent speakers with very different and diverse industries. So we'll get a rich exchange of information between them. I'll introduce Nazneen first. Nazneen Rahman. She has been a member of the board of AstraZeneca since 2017, and she is chair of their sustainability committee. She has received many awards, including a CBE, for services to medical science. She is the director of the Sustainable Medicines Partnership, which focuses on science-based solutions to make healthcare more sustainable. Today, she will share the vision and strategy that AstraZeneca is pursuing to embed sustainability, as she tells me, from the lab to the patient, and the transition that entails. Christophe Schramm is Head of Strategy and Sustainability in Siemens Energy, where he leads the business unit responsible for transformation of industry. He was responsible for coordinating the French Business Climate Pledge during COP21, the Paris Agreement. Now, at Siemens Energy, he oversees a range of technologies that we've been discussing today. So along that energy value chain, from conventional to renewable power, grid to storage, and electrification of industry. So he's going to discuss across those how Siemens is facilitating the decarbonisation pathways of the systems and the industrial customers. So in terms of allocating our time for this session, I'm going to ask you to start, Christophe, and then followed by Nazneen, and then we'll go to Q&A. So please.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So indeed, I've joined Siemens Energy, but only a few months ago, so my view is still quite new. And for those of you who don't know, I come from the regulator side. So I used to work for the French government, the European Commission, on renewables. So I've seen kind of both sides, and I think this is also what makes my current job interesting, because I would say, Siemens Energy, if we look at transition pathways, Siemens Energy really has a foot on each side of the fence, if I may say it this way. We come from the traditional gas turbine. For those of you who don't know, go to Huttenstraße here in Moabit. You will see one of the older plants in Germany, built shortly after 1900, that still makes some of the biggest gas turbines in the world. We're very proud of this, and we're selling them, and it's going very well. At the same time, we also have taken over a company called Gamesa, and we're now integrating the wind turbines. And you might have heard that this is not easy every day. And so even for technology that is considered in the area of renewables as a more mature technology, there is still significant risk that we are actually taking on to roll out this technology both onshore and offshore. Then, as was mentioned, we have the grid technologies, and grid is really growing thanks to renewables, I should say, and we have this area which is called transformation of industries that I'm part of, that represents about 5 billion out of the 30 billion of Siemens Energy. It's about 15,000 people out of the 100,000, and where we enable industries to decarbonize. Where we have, but basically it's a number of technologies from compressors to steam turbines to all kinds of electrification technology and electrolyzers that serve industries going from oil and gas, again, on the one side of the fence, if I may say this way, to people in a number of process industries, be it steel, pulp and paper, chemicals, and so on. So, what is our challenge? I think the challenge for us is to accompany all these industries in their transition. And some of them are already able to basically go for completely decarbonized solutions, and others are really just looking at going from, let's say, coal to gas, which in itself is progress. So we are really acting along the entire spectrum of let's say, challenges that industries face when they want to decarbonize. And so for us, when we look at our own emissions, let's say, profile, it really is mostly about our downward or downstream emissions, so scope 3 downstream, which is probably the biggest challenge that we have. Because, just to give you a few examples, I'm coming from industries, I'm trying to be specific. We sell compressors, and these compressors are being used typically in gas fields to, get gas out of the soil. You can run that compressor on a diesel or on a gas turbine, or you can run that compressor on an electric motor. The electric motor will clearly emit less than if you use a gas turbine. It is reducing emissions. It is very good for offshore gas platforms in Norway. Is it on a path towards net zero? Probably not. The same thing with the famous gas turbines, the big gas turbines from the Berlin plant. If you are in a brownfield setting where you replace an old generation gas turbine with a new generation gas turbine, you increase efficiency, you reduce emissions. Excellent. Is it therefore necessarily on the path to net zero? This is where we clearly, see our challenges. At the same time, we do use the profitability that, our conventional business offers us to fund some of the big bets that we make, wind being one, another one being hydrogen. And I would like to maybe spend a bit more time on this because this is part of our business. So we have a very significant bet in hydrogen. Where we have, developed technology on electrolyzers. We're working together with Air Liquide in a joint venture. We have opened up a gigafactory here in Berlin. We have announced a number of interesting projects. Just yesterday, another one with Luxcara. We have a project in France with Air Liquide. We have a number of other projects. What do we see? Because this is typically one of these areas where the debate is, is the glass half full or half empty? Is it going fast enough? What could be done more? So I think the technology is there. And the risk is actually more, if I may say this in a European setting, that we have Chinese technology come and take over all of it as has been the case in the case of PV, and as is currently the risk also for wind. Because I think there's one way of looking at decarbonizing, just using the cheapest technology out there, but I think there's also an industrial play, because as we know, by using the cheapest solution, we might also just be exporting a part of the problem. So let's put that aside. What do we see? Big push on the European side, clearly. Big ambitions on hydrogen, big ambitions also in the US. A number of mechanisms that have been put in place, the IRA, the Hydrogen Bank in Europe, and so on. But then difficulties to turn this into actual projects, because when then you really go to offtake agreements, because this is what we need, you find way less customers that are really able and willing today to sign those agreements. And this is what we need. When we talked about profitability, yes, we can probably not accept to sign projects in hydrogen with a profitability that is significantly lower than conventional projects in oil and gas at this point in time. So there is this difficult balance that we need to find between developing these new technologies, taking the right amount of risk, while accompanying, the evolution of the conventional ones. And here I'm really referring also to this interesting slide by Mr. YewMaker, I think, about these the cross dynamics. So here, hydrogen really is an example, I think, where we would probably expect more visibility on the funding mechanisms, more visibility also on aspects such as technical guarantees for this really to take off, because we think it's an important piece of the decarbonization story overall, especially, again, for these hard-to-abate sectors that we want to address, such as steel, such as fertilizer makers, and so on. Just to give you a kind of an introduction, and I think we'll be able to then discuss as we go.
That's great. Thank you. I think the thing for me that stands out in that is the movement of capital. I mean, that's what we were talking about in practice in the prior session, and now it's the sort of application of that from the old tech to the new, and that process of it being an engine of growth. Not just net zero is not just the cost, it is also an opportunity for growth in the value chains. And how are you seeing that? Can you give us the intro of how the sustainability and transition journey for AstraZeneca is going?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to represent AstraZeneca here, and AstraZeneca is really proud to support ECGI. And I'm going to give a really practical example of what it takes for a multinational. So if in case you don't know, AstraZeneca is a global biopharmaceutical company, active in 125 countries, 90,000 employees, really complex, highly regulated supply chain that we operate in. And I've been on the board since 2017. As you heard, I'm a doctor, I'm a scientist, I'm an academic. In many ways, I'm an unlikely person to be on a board of any corporation. I hadn't actually had any corporate experience before I joined AstraZeneca. And I had, I would say, a degree of uncertainty, possibly even skepticism, whether the motivations of a big corporation really could be aligned to delivering the planet that we need to, that our children deserve. But I was completely wrong. So, and I've been absolutely amazed at the passion, the potential, the opportunity that corporations, AstraZeneca, have been able to drive change internally, and hopefully that change externally. So I want to give you a little bit of a flavour for that. So I think we are an example of Rob Engel's fourth group of hope. We've essentially been delivering it on hope. But the reason we've done it is because of responsibility. So health and climate have a complex intersection. So the climate crisis is a health crisis. The climate crisis is leading to innumerable new challenges on health, from the silent things like air pollution to the very visible things like drought and heat and increasing transmission of viruses. And of course, we in the health sector, it is our duty, it is our responsibility to deal with those and to handle those increasing health burdens. But unfortunately, we are a very big contributor to the climate crisis. So conservatively, it was estimated that about 5% of global emissions come from the health sector, or sometimes another way people say that is that if the health sector was a country, it would be equivalent to the 5th largest emitting country. So we are making a very, very large contribution to this problem that it is our responsibility to try and manage. But at the same time, all health systems are under increasing pressure. We have to deliver more. So I think central to what we wanted to think about conceptually is, and I think it must apply to everybody, is how can we uncouple growth from emissions? And that is something that AstraZeneca has been able to do very successfully. We've had very substantial growth over the last decade. We are now currently the most valuable company in the UK. We overtook Shell. We are now a 200 billion market value company, a relatively small group in there. And that substantial growth has mainly happened over the last decade. During that same time, we have been able to reduce our absolute emissions by 17.5%. So we have been able to uncouple our growth from our emissions. So how have we been able to do that? So at a sort of strategic level, there were sort of 3 elements to it. The first element is that it had to matter. It had to matter to us, and it had to be seen to matter. It had to matter to our people, and everyone else externally had to know that it mattered. And that very much came from the top. We're blessed in many ways with our CEO, Pascal Soriot, but he is genuinely really passionate, really motivated, and really active in handling and from a personal and a company level climate crisis. Our former chair, Leif Johansson, and our current chair, Michel Demare, also totally committed. On the board, ends up it's my area of sort of day job now. So, but the whole board is also very committed. At our senior management level, directly reporting to the CEO, it's embedded our climate agenda. So it mattered. The other area in which made it matter is to have it as part of our scorecard for remuneration. So 10% of that is now directly correlated in terms of our carbon targets, so showing that it mattered. So the second thing was resourcing for success. For us, we've put over $1 billion so far in investment. I'm not sure whether everyone needs to do that. We had certain technical things that we needed to sort out. For example, the propellants in the inhalers that you need for asthma have global warming potentials far in excess of CO2. So we've had to put a lot of effort into having now sort of near zero propellants in those, which is probably a pretty niche problem I think most people don't have. But it is going to take resources, of course, both in money, in time, in commitment. And so I think you have to resource to succeed. And then the third thing was around having sort of measurement, a way of tracking our progress so we know where we're going. And again, we can show where we're at and where we're going to get. Here, I would say, compared to many areas of health, carbon is a real gift. And when you're trying to think about quality of life or life expectancy or health, it's really very, very hard to have measures that one feels comfortable with. But carbon, in many ways, is a wonderful surrogate in that regard. So we're able to do that, and wherever we can, we do that about absolute carbon. So those are the kind of framework, and then underneath that, then we have our sort of actions that we're actually sort of delivering on, and that has allowed us, we'll have a 98% reduction in our scope 1 and 2 emissions by the end of next year. For a manufacturing organisation globally, I'm sure everyone knows what that will have taken. We were one of the first 7 companies to go through SBTi to have our Scope 3 validated, which we're aiming to halve by 2030 and be net zero by 2045. So in those actions, there are some things that we can do on our own and are simple, and I think they often don't get enough airplay, I think. Switching off, changing your bulbs and having them on timers. We should all do that. Most people don't do that. It has a big impact. So moving forward on those, and then increasingly to these more areas which involve the whole sector, and obviously handling climate change is a team play. We either all win or we all lose, and we have to all win. So, and that is complex. Partnerships are complex, but we've been pleased to be able to do some areas where we've really been able to lead, particularly in helping our suppliers. We have a very complex supply chain. We've been working together with other pharmaceutical companies in order to enable our supply chain to make use of renewable energy. We've had some really interesting partnerships. For example, in the US, we have a partnership with Vanguard Renewables. It's called From Farm to Farmer. I love a bit of wordplay. So the farm is the cows, so we're using manure, or they're using manure there for biogas to now bring renewable gas to all of the US operations, and also potentially adding to the grid there. So it's just an example. I think we'll probably come back to how partnership is going to be absolutely key and how it's really hard, but just a little bit of flavour of what we've been doing at AstraZeneca.
That's great. That gives us a lot of ground to move on. And I think the idea that it goes in that sort of value chain, that it goes from your energy source using more renewable energy to the R&D in the lab, to the partnerships, to the patients' medicines, that's a really important one, I think, the holistic nature of it. And also that, again, it is a means for you of delivering economic value in the long term. I think that really complements your point about it's not just a cost, it's a means of having a new value chain. It's not just a cost, it's a means of future efficiencies. So I'm going to start with one question to both of you, because I think it's an important sort of magic wand waving moment. And then I will ask the audience for questions. And if I could just ask, before you ask your question, please state your name and affiliation. And I'll come to you just after this first one. So what I wanted to do was offer a magic wand, a little bit like the previous panel, of there's lots of things we've talked about there. We've talked about stakeholder acceptance. We've talked about the technologies being ready. We've talked about the regulation and the policy commitments. But you can only have one each, one wand waving, which will enable you to take away one of the most pressing barriers you face in terms of your transition pathways. And I'll start with you, Nazneen, and then to Christophe on what you would do.
So I think that I would like people. Can I change human behaviour? That's asking a bit much. I think we've talked about risk a lot. I think this central aspect around how, as humans, we're great at crises, things that are happening today. We can really muster a lot of courage and action, but we find it incredibly difficult to really sort of feel palpable these longer term risks, even if they're much bigger in the long term. And we haven't found a way, and we understand that about ourselves, but we need systems in order to compensate for our intrinsic inabilities. And I think a lot of people have talked about it in different ways. In my clinical specialty, I'm a geneticist, so I'm often talking to people about their risks of things that may or may not happen in the future and what they might or might not do about it. And what that taught me over 20 years is that people actually can do it when it comes to it and it matters, and they can actually quite quick to sort of adapt to it. But you have to sort of put it into that process. So I think we need to re-examine how we think about risk, uncouple it from compliance, and I think that will be centrally, if we can really bring the, I can't remember who said it was, we can't talk about tomorrow, it only has to be about today. The tomorrow has to happen today, and really make that powerful for people. I think it'll make a big difference. It's a bit philosophical, that answer.
Philosophical is good.
No, but I think I actually liked your answer. I mean, I only have one. So I will only talk about that. So I think it is also about taking away the fear of change. And I would like to go back to what you mentioned about COVID. COVID, I think, was an excellent experience. I mean, it was like, at global scale. What happens if you suddenly,
Experiment.
Experiment more than experience. Experience maybe not so much. No, experiment. If you basically just in my sector, you basically say, we need to get rid of Russian gas within 12 months, and in this country, it was considered impossible, and actually Germany weaned itself off Russian gas much faster than anything that had been planned for. At a cost, with a lot of disruption, for sure. I will not question that. But in the end, it was possible, and there was a social acceptance for it, and all of it. So I think there is a lot of fear around the change that would happen. Again, back to my company. If we were to wean ourselves off from some of the best customers that we have these days in oil and gas countries, and turn ourselves towards other areas, and I guess the same is true in many other settings, in many other industries, in many other sectors. So I think that's maybe the one thing where we need to collectively change.
Yes, I think we have an advantage in some ways because, as scientists, but in the science, we're used to things failing. People are always complaining about how many medicines fail. So that ability, but we have applied that certainly to the different strategies we've done through our transition things, thinking, well, let's try this, and if it doesn't work, and to be honest about that and not expect it, and then I think that feeds into a certain green hushing or whatever, or people feeling worried. We are in a period of experimentation, and we should be able to foster that. I agree.
Questions around the room, please.
Thank you. My name is Estelle Cantillon. I'm from the Free University of Brussels. So, I think it was interesting to hear the two contrasting experience, but in some ways comparing Siemens with AstraZeneca is not totally fair, because it feels like AstraZeneca has been faster and much more voluntary way towards reducing its carbon footprint. But it also seems that there are fewer arbitrages and trade-offs in that pathway, right? This is all about, improving operational efficiency and some product development, but you're not cutting yourself off from customers. Whereas Siemens seems to be that some of your business lines depend in some ways from, companies in the fossil fuel sectors, and so in that sense, it's this transition, figuring out that pathway seems to be harder. So I'm just I'd like to hear to what extent this is an unfair summary, and and your reaction to this.
Cannibalization cross subsidies. Over to you.
Well, no, thank you. I think that indeed, again, our technologies as such are not the problem. 99% of our emission problem is what you do with our technologies. Okay, and you can use gas turbines tomorrow to run them on hydrogen. If that hydrogen comes from water electrolysis with renewables, we're all fine, okay? So technologically speaking, you can imagine all kinds of pathways to the future where all of this just remains part of the big Siemens Energy family, and we're all happy. The reality obviously is a little bit more complicated, and this is what I was trying to explain. And we have signed up for SBTi in 2019. We have our targets for 2030. I could have told you all of this, but I think it's not really cutting to the chase. So I would not necessarily rank the challenge that we have versus maybe other companies. Clearly, we are, with our downstream emissions, one of the biggest contributors to emissions in the German DAX. So clearly, it is not an easy topic for us. At the same time, we are also those that take up humongous risks to develop some of those renewable technologies, such as wind or hydrogen. and there are not that many people out there that are trusted to also, operate those assets, be able to service them for 20, 30 years. So we think we have a play, and we are clearly part of the solution towards this decarbonization. On this decarbonization pathway, but it requires indeed, finding the right curve for and to a certain extent, this is where I would also agree with what was said before. It cannot be us alone making that change, because as long as we will be able to work with customers in the gas industry, we will continue to do so. So there is also, it's about regulations, it's about global frameworks, and this is maybe the occasion to mention, I think that CSRD, it was mentioned briefly before, I think that CSRD is going to be a game changer. We have 300 data points to collect, out of which, there's stuff on all kinds of things, but there's a big share on climate. And creating that transparency for investors, but also for our own shareholders, is going to certainly be a game changer, especially because it will become as stringent as the financial reporting piece. So I'm clearly confident, even if that we have a challenging pathway in front of us.
And if I in any way gave the impression that what AstraZeneca has done was easy, please, don't take that from this at all. I don't think it's easy, and we are an outlier, I would say, in that regard. And I think the health sector in general, rightly or wrongly, has a bit of a sort of, they're allowed to sort of not do things because, we're providing health. And we saw that again in COVID. There was a mountain of all sorts of things that were happening, but we will prioritize our health and the health of our loved ones above everything. So I think there are a lot of challenges there. I think a lot of healthcare is under extreme pressure, cost pressures, in the companies like the AstraZenecas or the Roches, we're new developments. So we have a different thing from your everyday medicines, which are high volume, low margins. So I think all of those pressures are the same as all the sectors, and so I wouldn't say that we're sort of reflective of that. What we can do, though, as I say, and what we're doing at this stage is particularly trying to help our supply chain, that sort of networking effect, both by working with other companies in our sector, but also collectively helping the supply chain. And again, that's not easy, and I'm sure everyone here has had examples of just trying to corral. And often you're working with your competitors to now collaborate, and just or all sorts of regulations has inadvertently are really very unhelpful as we now try and make these transitions. And I think we're facing that as much as anywhere else. What I suppose I was meaning to say that in that is, if you can really align that your mission as a company delivering for your shareholders and your mission as a responsible things, what I've seen there is that can really be catalytic, and that's really what we've been able to see.
Please.
Yeah, you already transitioned to the kind of interface between finance and the real sector, and this is also what my question is about. So you mentioned, both of you essentially, that you would like to see, in a way, more risk-taking, like more productive risk-taking, more entrepreneurial spirit, and kind of, and after the financial crisis, the financial sector has been kind of regulated in a way to discourage risk-taking, but at the same time, it's essential to the transition. So my question is, to what extent do you think that access to finance is actually a restriction, as part one, and to what extent do you think this is driven by, too cautious kind of investment mentalities from the financial sector?
I mean, again, health is a very cautious. We're very anti-risk as well, and I think, again, as we were talking a bit, the risk, the immediate risk, or for us, the risk for the patient in front of you, combined to the risk that might happen because the planet is burning or whatever. So I think being able to have a more flexible attitude to risk, and so that how you use that risk or you apply that risk has more flexibility into it, I think is going to be really essential across the board. And I think finance and healthcare are pretty similar in that regard. I think we certainly have seen incentivizations around there where they can align. So I think there probably is also real opportunities there for some of the perhaps more entrepreneurial, whether that's in the finance sector or any sector. But I think some more flexibility there is going to be for sure essential.
And to pass that, before I pass that to you, Christophe, can I actually ask, as a build on that, do you find that any element of the risk-based pricing sort of affects the capital allocation decisions or the hurdles for new investments? Or do you find yourself more or less risk-averse going into the bet on hydrogen when you're trying to cross-subsidize, for example? It would be very interesting to hear if that plays out.
Well, clearly it does. When if I just take the example again of hydrogen, because I think it explains it well for all kinds of new technologies. So we go into this looking at it as one technology among many, and so obviously the projects that are brought forward in hydrogen are compared to other projects in more conventional areas, and we will compare the risk and reward profile of these projects. The difference is that in hydrogen, often these projects, infrastructure projects with SPVs, so there's the question around bankability and who takes the risks and so on. So this is a typical debate that we have, but it's about maturing our technology, being able to anticipate the risks that we might incur over the lifetime of the asset, and so I think that's our business, and this is what we're paid to do. However, we might be in situations where we compete against more innovative players, smaller players. I used to be in a startup for fuel cells, by the way, so I know the other side of the story, where it's basically life or death. I win this project, my company value is basically times 10. I lose the project, and I look for a new job, and it's really like this. Basically, these companies are able to take on or willing to take on much bigger risks, which is a good thing because it sees projects emerge. The downside is that then these projects, once they need to be really executed, might also face much more problems and might actually never see the light of the day. Because it's a developer, and then by the time the thing needs actually to run, the developer is already somewhere else. And so that then can be a problem for the credibility of the sector as a whole. Does electrolysis work to produce whatever e-fuels or, So I think that's what we need to handle. So I think the question is not so much do we have access to capital. I think there's now, I would say we talk to specialized funds when needed, but I think we have what is needed. It's more creating the right environment, again, so that our customers are willing to take that extra risk. And there we actually believe, what we see is that in sectors where there is an obligation for players to decarbonize, this really helps. I would agree, probably it's a mix of everything, but typically if I had a wish today for hydrogen, I would probably say, just impose, just in quotation marks, impose a share of green steel in the steel sector, and that will basically pull the entire value chain, and it's might be easier than some of the other things that are being thought about today.
Patrick, please. I saw the hand up. And I think after this we might have time for one more, so please. All right.
thank you. So this is a question for Nazneen. And it's about biodiversity. So you explained how committed AstraZeneca is to limiting the climate impact in terms of reducing its emissions and has a net zero target. But AstraZeneca is also nature dependent, and especially preservation of biodiversity, because that's where you probably will find new drugs. And so, does AstraZeneca has a policy on trying to preserve biodiversity?
Nazneen, before you answer that, I'll take the final question as well, because I'm getting the time signal, and we'll answer them together.
Thank you very much, because it's very much in line with what Patrick is asking. So essentially, since we are talking about transformation of manufacturing processes, what are the other important dimensions beyond CO2, the pathway, so the use of water or preserving biodiversity?
Okay, very complimentary. So Nazneen, please, then Christophe.
Yes, I mean, I think that, and again, we've touched on it here, it is a holistic problem. We have to sort of pull things out as humans so that they feel manageable to us. And as I say, in part, the carbon and the climate is really important, and we can measure it. So I think we went where we could really drive forward action. But that doesn't mean we're not doing the other things. Obviously, social dimensions across the board are very important to a health company. That aspect of sustainability more broadly in terms of access is really important. We have strategies on that. Biodiversity also, I think that here, I think there are areas within our operations in manufacturing, whether it's in green solvents, which are really important for medicines, or as I say, new propellants, which we're doing, where what we're doing actually can meaningfully have an impact both on our products and just more generally across the world. I think with biodiversity here, we actually don't harvest any sort of new drugs from plants, so they've been incredibly important for drugs. For us, really, what that's been is about the biodiversity in terms of certainly all of where our operations are. We also have an initiative called AZ Forest, where we are working with partners to plant 200 million trees, but that's centered in both the social and the biodiversity. So underlying that, there's a really strong component. And I think here, again, being science-driven, we're not experts in that area. So for us, what we've done is really done really diligent research to find the right partners in order to be able to, because it's actually pretty easy to do the wrong thing or to do bad things, I think. So to find the right partners and to really center that, it is across 6 continents, but really also where we're operational. So I think it matters. I think overall organizations really leaning to the areas where they can lead and they can have it feels to me a good strategy. And then in those other elements, making sure that one's partnering appropriately, that would be our strategy.
So maybe to your point on what else matters, if I understood well your question, I would maybe draw the attention to this nexus between decarbonization and the raw materials question, because I mean, it's known that if you go for battery electric vehicles, just to mention that example, there is a question on resources regarding lithium and some other rare earth. We have a rare earth in our wind turbines. We use a lot of PFAS. For those of you who know or who don't know, it's basically fluorochemicals that have a very strong bond between the carbon and the fluor. That's basically why they were developed. That's the whole purpose of them. But obviously that makes them also persistent in the environment and in the human body. They're used in a number of things. They're excellent sealants. You can use them typically as membranes and electrolyzers of fuel cells. If you basically say, I don't want all this, then you probably can also put a cross on a lot of the technologies that we say are the ones that we want to have, including PV. Solar PV also uses some of those fluoropolymers. So you need to, find again solutions. I think it's not an easy question, but I think we need to have the global picture also to avoid falling from certain dependencies towards certain parts of the world into other dependencies with other parts of the world. And the rare earth discussion with our Chinese friends on this is a good example in case.
10 minutes more. We have 10 minutes more, people. So I've been gifted an additional amount of time, which I'm now gifting to you as well. Please.
Yeah, there was Tom Gosling, LSE and ECGI. There's been quite a lot of discussion today about what the finance sector needs to do. What's been quite interesting about this discussion is that there hasn't been so much discussion about what the finance sector needs to do. And I'm just wondering whether anything that the finance sector has done or could do has any relevance at all to what you've done on climate.
I'm still thinking.
No.
Well, I suppose it comes back to responsibility. We didn't feel like we were going to wait for anybody to do anything in that sense. So we wanted to have a strategy which we could drive forward. I think, as has come up again today, is that these things are complicated. We all know that, but we've run out of time. But it's not quite clear who and when is going to move fast enough. So I think then that's what we've done. But I think, coming back to the earlier question, we are not typical at all of the health sector or the pharma sector. So I think what finance could do and perhaps started to do, but to be fair, I don't think really had very consistent messages around that, would be help to accelerate for others, I think, in that sort of sense. So we can perhaps work together in that sense to be able to find really meaningful ways in which the capital, we've been able to put the capital in, but most people can't. So I think there must be, certainly at this point, ways in which the finance, and it comes back to partnership again, different types of partnerships, whereby I would say it's outside, I'm not very much engaged in the finance sector, so I might be misrepresenting in terms of that sense. But I don't know about the past, but in terms of the present or the future, for sure.
Well, that gave me the time to think. So I actually have an opinion on this. So I think you could, I don't know whether this is the finance sector, but what I can tell you is there is a challenge or a problem in the way that in the level of scrutiny from, let's say, the market, as we like to call them, with regard to the short term and the long term, or the medium term. We work on compressed air energy storage. We worked on carbon capture usage and storage. We work on decarbonization of heat. We work on small modular reactors. We're in the French embassy. I think we can talk about nuclear. So all these things take time. And typically, these are projects that might not yield the same level of profitability as some of the more established stuff. And I think there has been an evolution in the recent past where the attention from analysts to the exposure to climate risks typically has decreased, and where maybe the attention is more again to more short-term topics. Clearly, the war in Ukraine has increased the focus on energy security. The economic situation, at least in Europe, is again increasing the question on competitiveness, or basically energy prices, and all this basically moves us a bit away from the third piece, of the famous triangle of energy policy, which is sustainability. So I think there, a continued challenge from the finance world, and I would say, the finance world at large, is necessary to help us also keep the focus on the more longer term things, while obviously not sacrificing entirely the short term.
And being surrounded by finance professors as we are, I feel it would be remiss not to say that actually the fact that the capital is moving internally within AstraZeneca towards the things that are going to be part of the core corporate growth strategy around sustainability, as well as around the new value chains and the entrepreneurial risk-taking that you've described on that as well, Christophe. I mean, that is consistent with a pecking order theory of finance, that you use the retained earnings before you go to the external markets, which may not be able to price, where there's a lot of informational asymmetry around what the risks of the new technologies will be. So I feel that there's a certain amount of defense to be added here, where actually the multinationals are as big as small countries in some instances. Can I do a quick sweep up if there's any other questions? Or please, Sophie.
Great panel. So I think one of the things I hear from some companies is particularly on the SME side. So as you pointed out, some companies are pretty much the size of an economy. And in the SMEs, and we heard with Professor Engel earlier, the termination topic. And I think SMEs are probably faced with a quicker termination issue than others. So I guess my question is 2 points. One is, within your supply chains, you do work with SMEs, I imagine. And within your SMEs, if they have to do the transformations that are required so that you can reach your objectives, most of them don't have the resources, not just financial, but also intellectual resources and people resources, in terms of not just knowledge, but people, because they don't have the money to hire the people that they need to do it, or the time in terms of prioritization. Do you have policies or processes to support these SMEs, number one? And number two, do you have any suggestions? Because I think the social cost of the transition for SMEs, which is pretty much the economy of most countries, is going to be pretty significant.
Yeah, I feel really passionately about this area. I think in some ways there is obviously a moral requirement to drive change, but people are living with real difficulties pretty much across the world now. We have a really long, deep, complex, every type of supply chain within that. I think one of the things we want to do is to try and facilitate that as much as we can, but at the same time we want to drive change, so there's a little bit of a tension there. I think we've talked a lot today about harmonizing, simplifying requirements for whether it's regulation or accountability around that. We have to do that because they're dying by Excel spreadsheets. They're sort of having to supply all their different information around there. The other thing in a really practical way is, for example, we're part of an initiative called Energize by Schneider Electric, which allows them to access our power purchase agreements across that. About 286 of our suppliers have signed up for that. In China, we've worked together with Novo Nordisk and Roche to do a green procurement things to around where China's a big market for us. So they are nuanced. They're different in different areas. I think we have to really focus on this, because they could easily, as you say, get lost there, and that's a loss to all of us. And it's one of those sort of unintentional consequences that can happen. But I think for the bigger companies, we need to do it, because otherwise we can't fulfill our commitments. But it comes back to this ways of being able to do partnerships in ways that we've never really had to do before, I think. And as I say, I think the intellectual capital that's needed to be able to design those so that they work is something that could be shared across many sectors. I think most sectors are sort of facing that. So I think thank you for raising it. I think it's a really important point.
Maybe what I can add is, clearly, when it comes to the suppliers in our supply chain, we bring them along. Also, we have also in China actually started an initiative where we ask our suppliers to report on their own decarbonization efforts, and that already is a way to bring them along in this transition. The same way as our customers are asking us, do you have a life cycle analysis for your compressor? And when we don't have the answer, we get 0 in the environmental performance note for that bid, and it makes us think. Typically, I mean, this is a real life example. Then it's also true that we have a lot of customers that we help. Because as I mentioned, our mission is to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors. And typically in the pulp and paper world, there are companies that are not big enough necessarily to do all of the thinking on this by themselves. And so we are actually thinking at the moment typically about energy management systems, all kind of digital solutions that we can also bring to the market to help these industries first optimize and then decarbonize more deeply. So I think we're also clearly bringing solutions to these types of players.
Those words, optimize and then decarbonize, it feels like the economist's call to arm. Allocation of scarce resources in optimized ways. I'll end the panel at this point. Thank you very much to our excellent speakers and to all of you for being so engaged. I think I've heard three things right now, which are the themes of this panel. The first I've heard is that it's about a holistic approach, that given the interdependencies and the path dependencies, big corporates especially don't have the luxury of just reducing their own scope 1 and 2 emissions, or even 3. It's about working up and down that value chain with the suppliers, with the customers, facilitating that uptake, decarbonizing your industrial customers, which is the privilege and the responsibility of the larger corporates in terms of the transition planning. I think the second thing I heard, which I found really resonant with Professor Engel's, fourth, we must have hope, and President Fabius's optimism exhortation, is that but with both of you in different ways, there's that idea that net zero is not necessarily a net cost. It can be a means of delivering value. It can even be a means of transforming your industry to gain that value. And that is consistent with some research that Oxera has done on how when you start to stack up the regulation and the fiscal policy stimulus and the carbon pricing and the private sector innovation, that's when you can unlock GDP growth that doesn't crowd out the decarbonization objective, is not crowding out or being crowded out by the sort of application of that economic growth. And I find that at a time of existentially important threat, I find that a really reassuring message of the decarbonization doesn't have to be at the expense of stifling economic growth. So I found that quite a good sort of corporate message. And the final one, which tees us up, I hope, for State Secretary Jennifer Morgan's imminent closing keynote, is that I have heard that it is about that concatenation, that convergence and coalescing of forces, that it's about the capital and it's about the technologies, absolutely. It's also about the stakeholder acceptance, but then that pivotal role that you have both talked about and others have talked about of regulation and policy can either provide that barrier along the transition pathway, or it can take your hand and walk you along it. So that feels like a good moment to hand over for our closing keynote. But thank you all very much.